Greetings, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another edition of Rock, Rocking Rocker. I'm your host, Dylan Sexton, coming to you from the man cave, as usual. Today I've got a couple of topics I'd like to talk about. Number one, I'd like to talk about a website called Rhino.com, and in particular the Rhino.com/handmade. Rhino Handmade. It's a label that Rhino has where they release previously discontinued albums and special reissues and other rare albums. For instance, this is the Sky Kings. Rhino Handmade released it as a limited number. They released it in only 5,000 of these. This is numbered. It's 2,943 of 5,000. The Sky Kings were a sort of a country band in the 90s, featuring John Cowan of the Bluegrass Revival, Bill Lloyd from the country band Foster and Lloyd, and Rusty Young from Poco. The Sky Kings never were really signed. They were like an industry sort of secret, they were gonna happen, you know. But they ultimately never were signed. Somehow Rhino Handmade got the tapes and released it, and it's not a bad album. They do a pretty faithful version of Fooled Around and Fell in Love that they actually released as a single. The liner notes are really good in here, and they detail all the trouble it takes to be a country band in the 90s, particularly, you know, following the rules of Nashville. Like the executives didn't want them to have more than one lead singer because they thought it would confuse people. Another album that I got from Rhino Handmade is the first two albums by the band Rank and File. They were a favorite of mine in the 80s, a country punk band. They had two albums that I really liked, Long Gone Dead and Sundown. They released both of them on Rhino Handmade, limited edition. They released 2,500 of these, and I've got number 439. And there's a couple of other extra tracks on here to do the Wabash Cannonball. Pretty cool. And I also ordered from them Dan Hicks' It Happened One Bite, sort of an abortive attempt at a soundtrack, I think, by him. I don't recommend this. Can't win them all. This one was number 2. Actually, they released 4,500 of these, and this is number 3,756. The only track on here that I really liked was, and this shows my age, he does a version of Lulu's Back in Town. Alright, now what I'd like to talk about next is the influence of jazz on rock and roll. And what got me started thinking about this is Chicago and the Doobie Brothers are going to be touring this summer, and Jess and I are thinking of taking the boys. It's a good summer concert, you know, sit out on the grass and listen to some Chicago. And if there's any band in rock and roll, and particularly in their early albums, that was influenced by jazz, it has to be Chicago. So, but before I get to talking about all the bands that were influenced by jazz and the jazz that influenced them and was influential, I have to go to Mass right now, and I have to go to a birthday party for my sister Misty. But at that birthday party, to get us started in the jazz sort of mood, my brother-in-law Shawn and I are going to be sampling this Brother Thelonious Belgian style Abbey Ale. It looks delicious. Hopefully it will be. I'll let you know how it goes. Okay, I told you I was going to tell you about how it was, but I'm going to go one better. I'm going to show you how good it is. You know, we're going to taste it right here. This is Shawn. You remember him from episode 3 of, he's my brother-in-law and good friend. We're going to try this Brother Thelonious Belgian style Abbey Ale. We poured it. We're going to, smells good. Let's see it. Cheers.
That's an Abbey Ale.
You say, and so Thelonious Monk, you're familiar with Thelonious.
Yeah.
It's sort of I call him the the weirdo genius of jazz. He's kind of an eccentric guy. Kind of a little. Took me a while to get used to him.
You would think that hopefully it wouldn't take you too long to get used to this ale.
What do you think? What is your opinion?
It's definitely it's an Abbey Ale. It's like a coffee with 4 creams and 4 sugars, for sure.
Awesome.
It's definitely all you want in an Abbey Ale. It's a Belgian thing. You got to expect it, and it's definitely a nice warming drink on a winter day.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I had before we came in here to film this. I had a Coors Light. This is.
Oh man.
This is the big leagues compared to a Coors Light.
Yeah.
And I like it. It's good.
Yeah. Very good.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks.
So that was a good party, and the rather felonious beer was good, very tasty. So we're going to talk about jazz right now. My history with jazz started when I was working at the Los Alamos National Lab. I was living on a ranch in the middle of the desert, the high desert, in the middle of nowhere, and I went on an adventure of the musical variety, looking at different styles, and I decided to explore jazz. One of the first albums that I bought when I explored it was Time Out by the Dave Brubeck Quartet. One of the most famous jazz albums of all time. If you haven't heard it, if you're going to buy one jazz album, I recommend you buy this one. A couple of years ago, I and my friend Kelly Wilson saw him in concert. I might as well have seen Elvis. The Dave Brubeck Quartet is that important as far as I'm concerned. After a while of listening to jazz, I started to figure out, there's a lot of bands, that are influenced by jazz. Looking back on it, say, like the Billy Joel 52nd Street. If anybody that knows that album can think of the song Zanzibar. Has a famous jazz saxophonist, Freddie Hubbard, doing the solo on it. Or also, if you want to think of Van Morrison, there's an album, Van Morrison with Georgie Fame and Friends. Awesome album. Very jazz influenced. In fact, recorded live at a jazz club. Very famous song on here, Your Mind Is on Vacation. Jazz blues guitar piano player Mose Allison wrote that song. And so Van Morrison is another rock and roll performer who's influenced by jazz. Another guy that influenced a lot of rock and rollers, influenced me just in how cool he looked, was Chet Baker. Another guy to check out. I always thought his vocals were like, can this guy really sing? But I mean, hey, if the guy from the Red Hot Chili Peppers can sing, then this guy can definitely sing. Chet Baker's worth checking out. Cool jazz. Think of classic bands, jazz bands that sort of towed the line between rock and roll and jazz. Chuck Mangione. I've given this album a listen countless times. Great stuff. And if I'm going to think about jazz albums that have influenced me also, Miles Davis. Kinda Blue. Probably the most famous jazz album out there, ever. He's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I guess he's influenced a lot of rockers. I guess that would be the criteria. Jessica and I have recently seen Johnny Mathis. Straddles the line between pop and jazz, but definitely, has a toe in the jazz world. Heavenly is a great album. And finally, Frank Sinatra. Who can forget Frank Sinatra? And who can deny his influence? Even though I don't know that he was a big fan of rock and roll. He eventually did a duet with Bono. And getting back to Chicago. The horn-dominated section of those guys, very jazz influenced. Steely Dan, one of the first concerts I saw with my friend and progressive rock bass master Mark Matos was Steely Dan. Those guys are definitely influenced by jazz, had a lot of jazz musicians playing on their albums. And, Blood, Sweat and Tears, very jazz influenced. So there you have it. In a nutshell, jazz does influence rock and roll. And if you haven't given jazz a chance, if you're watching this and you're thinking, I'm a rock and roll guy, give some jazz a chance. Particularly, if I'm going to recommend 3 albums, Time Out by Dave Brubeck Quartet, Kinda Blue by Miles Davis, and pretty much anything by Chet Baker. And I guess that's it. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Rock Rockin' Rocker. Once again, I'm your host, Dylan Sexton, coming to you from the Man Cave. Peace.
This episode of Rock Rockin' Rocker is brought to you by Melt Candles and Wax. Melt has a scent for every season. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and shop Melt Candles and Wax on Etsy. We're hand poured with love.